So today we're going to talk about normals and surfaces and shading and all that kind of stuff. What I have here is a beautiful sphere lit by a nice little light here. I'll just drag that around and you can see how that illuminates this lovely creation. However, this isn't actually a sphere. It's a polyplane. And if you happen to look off to the side here, you would have seen it says polyplane. If I go ahead and switch cameras, you can see quite clearly that this indeed is just a single polyplane. This is a single polyplane with a normal map on it. If I were to switch that normal map with, say, a bump map, you notice that it doesn't create quite the same end result. The details are significantly off, and what we get this kind of stepped pattern off of this surface, getting gradually down and down and down, despite my having baked this off of specific values. And I can see some of these edges from the original polygons come through. But that's essentially what happens with a bump map. Bump maps really don't do contoured shapes all that well. Bump maps are good for basic surface detail. A rock texture, a brick texture is fine. Maybe a little bit of wood grain, or little details like that. However, a normal map is much better for details that contain contours or different angles, and this is because a bump map is just depth information, whereas a normal map contains multiple angles locked in different channels, different colors. So when we look at these Cartesian coordinates up here and here, we see a red, green, and blue value. Well, red, green, and blue are also part of images. So I just clipped this guy down. This is the original bake from a 3D surface, so I just took a sphere and baked it down. And I'll show how that was accomplished. And if we go into the channels and take a look at this, the red channel is lit from the right-hand side, it goes dark to the left. The green goes from the top to the bottom, and then blue is essentially supposed to be depth. And the closer to camera should be the white, and the darker it gets, the further away from camera it gets. Now you note this white region, and then these other blank regions. These guys are essentially a 0.5, a 1/2 value. If I go and deal with them in the 256 values, I get a 128, or B 50%. So this is half, half, and full. And what that means is essentially this. When we deal with the blue region, we're talking about depth information coming down to the base, and so gradual levels working their way down. But when we get to these guys, the default setting should be the normal facing away from the surface. And in order for that to work so that we could rotate it either direction, in this case, right and left, we have to start in this kind of intermediary position, so in between. So that's my 0.5 right there. Of course, I have a 1 and a 0. The same thing goes for the other channel. So the red and green channel are about rotating this normal information from left to right and forwards and backwards, whereas the blue channel is just depth, and it's just a matter of going from the highest point down to the lowest point. So it just picks one of them, and it happens to be by default that it's the highest point that it chooses first. So with that idea in mind, it's actually not that difficult to simply go in and just make your own normal map if you wanted. Knowing that information, you could essentially go ahead and say, well, you know what, I can just go ahead and paint something black and white. Nice soft brush here. Let's put the darkness on the other side here, and the light on the other side. And you do the same thing over here, and the highlight above, and the shadow below. And then of course, just tapping that brush here, tap, 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 and I've got essentially the same thing. I can basically create my own little normal map the same way, and as long as I know which direction the lighting should hit on any particular surface, I could go ahead hand painting from one surface to the next in these channels. So you can create your own normal maps in this manner, which is great. It's something that we can keep in mind if we ever come to a point where we have to start correcting normal maps that have gone wrong, which tends to happen sometimes when the surfaces intersect each other incorrectly. There's a little bit of confusion when the program bakes out those normal maps from the surface, and quite often the channel to suffer the most will usually be the blue channel. It'll be a little bit of information that goes a little bit wrong. Things like, let me deselect that, put a big sort of black region, and you'll see these dark orangey yellow kind of colors. Those are usually indications of normals gone wrong, usually in the blue channel, which are easy enough to go ahead and fix out. Something to keep in mind is you can take this blue channel in its entirety and do that. Just save that. And load it up in Maya. Oops. And you note that even though it doesn't have that depth information anymore, it still looks fairly round. It doesn't have quite the same angle at the edges as it did before, but all the same, it does have that sense of roundness. So in many cases, the left and right and top and bottom information is enough to give you the detail that you require across any surface. So painting out something to a kind of whitish color or adjusting that Z depth channel a little bit is not really the thing that's going to kill your final image. So you can go ahead and flatten that out and save it out, or make all sorts of corrections in the channel without suffering too much damage to your final normal map. So that's fixing the normal map, and that's kind of the difference between bump maps and the sort of displacement, or sorry, not displacement, bump map and normal map. Now, there are things like displacement and vector displacement, and they have the same kind of differences. Displacement is just depth information. It's just that one channel's worth of information, this kind of straight up depth idea. And then there's vector displacement, which has usually high color depth. And what it has the ability to do is for each level, when we're dealing with something like 0 to 255 value, 8-bit information. That's just how much information we have. But it appears that in vector displacement it has the ability to use this kind of coordinates for individual steps. So if I continue this to the next step says actually it went this direction. And on the next step it said that actually it went in this direction. And in the next step it says that actually it went this direction. And you have the ability to do things that actually curl around and create occluded areas. So it would be this shape that you couldn't get out of displacement, since displacement can only do depth. And if this was a regular displacement map, the best you could hope for would be something kind of like that, where all this information would essentially be solid. It just has the ability just to go up and down. So vector displacement has the ability to go around kind of corners. If you ever paint a vector displacement inside of Mudbox, you notice that with each step you start playing with this, you will see actually things will go up and then they'll start to curl, and they'll start to curl more, and start to go around. If you use, for example, there's the default examples like the ear that's in there, vector displacement maps, you'll see that kind of behavior going on a regular grid. Just starts to go up and then fill in and fill in and fill in. So that's how they work. The difference between a bump map and a normal map and a displacement map, vector displacement map, is essentially that a bump map only deals with the normals on the surface. And with a displacement map, what it does is it actually tessellates the geometry, which basically means that it takes any individual surface, and then it proceeds to break it up into more pieces, and then physically moves those vertices outwards based on the values provided. So it basically does a smooth on your object and starts moving vertices around. And that does that every time you basically click render. So obviously, this process requires a lot more CPU calculations, which means longer render times every frame in order for it to do that little function. And for a normal map, it just has to calculate just normal information, which is fairly fast to go, which is why it's used in video games. So let's come to a better understanding of what is a normal. Let me just set up the scene quickly. So I've got an object here, and just actually going to go back to default shading mode. If I grab this guy has two kinds of normals on its surface. If I go ahead and want display polygons, and I have face normals and vertex normals. Face normals basically determine the direction of an individual face. Whether or not they're facing towards a camera or not, basically does some of those calculations. And it's used for things like, should I render you or should I not render you? If we have back face culling on, then it'll determine whether or not when I select through an object, if it will select the things on the opposite side. So there's lots of uses for face normals in terms of that set of rules. If I go to the vertex normal though, I simply grab a vertex and just go to display, heads up display, poly count, and I were to select this vertex, turn off the soft selection mode here, this one vertex, I've got a single vertex. This is a closed surface, so these points are all merged into one. But if I go to vertex face mode, you'll note that there's still an individual vertex per face. For every individual face on this object, each one of these vertices has a normal, and that normal is used to determine the shading of this object. The normal in this particular corner here controls this corner region of shading, starting at this point and gradiating outwards. This one, again, gradiates outwards and fills this area, and so on and so forth. If this normal is facing towards a light, this area becomes bright and gradually gradiates outwards. If it is facing away from a light, it simply goes dark and gradiates out. So let's see if we can modify this. If I go to my polygons, go to normals, there's a variety of different normal tools. If I go ahead and say vertex normal edit tool, you can see all these individual vertex normals. And of course, I can change the facing of that, and you can see how that shading is altered when it faces towards the camera in this particular case, because that's where the light is coming from in this default mode. And as I face it more towards the other direction, it becomes darker. So the closer to light, the lighter it gets, and dark the other direction. Now this happens for each individual face, and if I go ahead and let's just move that one, this one, if we go back to regular surface, you note that now this looks like it's been cut open. And that's because all the normals now in the corners are facing in different directions, so therefore their individual quadrants are much more easy to see. If I were to simply go ahead and grab that vertex, and I just move that, that will automatically snap them together, kind of unifying them. I'll just pull it out to the center there. And now they become much more unified. And there's a little bit of weird indentation because it's not following exactly the orientation of the rest of these guys on that surface. It's aiming slightly outwards. To make that even more obvious. So I aim that downwards. As I move into a position where it's aiming downwards, you see it becomes brighter. As I go up, it becomes darker. So all of your shading across the surface handled this in this way. If I were to go ahead and grab this section of edges right here and set these to harden, basically all it's done is it's set those guys to face the same direction as the face normal for each individual face, at least along this edge, although they are connected to each other here, and so they do even out, they average out, but they are facing outwards. Let's just go into that other tool. You can see that they've separated them this way, so they're not quite unified. And what this does is creates essentially the idea of a hard edge. This could be something like an open edge where a belt is, or something like that, a connection between shirt and pants, or some other detail that you wanted to emphasize through the shading. Of course, if I were to take this and say normals average, so I should essentially try and smooth everything out. This one being still locked, so I'm going to unlock that one. As soon as I modified it, it locked it, and I'll go back in there and I will re-average those normals, and therefore now everything has been nicely smoothed out. So something else that we could play with here. Grab this guy, just going to drag him out. I could go normals and say set normal angle, and based on an angle it would calculate if it was smooth or hard. So if I apply this, you note that unlock that, apply. You note that these guys became hard edges, whereas the rest of them being under that 30 became soft. If I increase this, of course, to say 80 degrees or so, and apply that, now only things above 80 degrees, like 90-degree angles or more, become sharp edges, whereas the rest become soft. So you can use this to quickly create separations on a surface that you've been doing things like extrusions on or whatnot, where you may not have the soft and hard edge combination that you wanted to really get a good shading across a low poly surface. So when we look at this object, and we look at, say, this object right here, polygons are kind of a limited supply. In order to get this to appear more detailed, the only information that's important to us is the overall silhouette. As we noted with the sphere, I changed that silhouette simply by cutting an alpha channel into it, and the rest was done by the smoothing in here to kind of cut that open. So as long as your silhouette is good, normal maps will give the illusion of a much more detailed mesh. Now, the reason why this is possible is the same reason why I can make this more detailed, even though it is baked on a lower res mesh. The interior here, the smoothing is done quite nicely, and yet the edge is what's rough, by simply going in and cleaning up that edge, because, quite frankly, I have quite a lot of pixels that I can use in order to do this. I can make it appear as if it was higher geometry than it actually was. This is the same principle going on in 3D. Instead of adding millions of faces on the surface, all I have to do is calculate the normals of that surface in a different way. So rather than figuring out where each individual vertex is and calculating that from movements and position, etc., I can go ahead and just keep track of a few points, but within each area subdivide this in terms of normals to do that calculation. So for every pixel in here, and there's my dog, for every pixel on the surface, you will have a new normal, essentially. So the more detailed normal map, the more detail that you have potential for on a mesh, even though it's low resolution. So that's kind of the advantage to overall using these normal maps. So hopefully that clears up what a normal map is and why we use them. So let's just cover how I made that quick normal map. So it's a simple matter. You can use any kind of surface with as few or as many polygons as you want. So I'm just going to have a few. And I take a more detailed mesh. What happens here is that this surface, right here, will seek upwards and look at the other normals that are around it. And in some cases, it'll even seek backwards to see stuff below it. So if I were to take this and put it above, it should still seek below and be able to figure that stuff out. So I'm going to grab this object, go to rendering, lighting and shading, transfer maps, automatically get selected. I want the information of the normals from this high res surface, so I'll add that as a source mesh, and I can simply pick normal map. Just remove this one, click normal, and then pick place for it to save. Pick a format that's preferable to me, and I can pick whether I want tangent space or object space. Tangent space is a calculation relative to the original object individual faces and their neighbors. So it basically calculates from one face to the next to the next to the next. In object space, it calculates based off of the original Cartesian coordinates, so the world coordinates. World space basically, as an object, means that you can usually have deeper details for shading, but the disadvantage is that the object is always calculated based on those pure color values and the original world coordinates. So if I had a character with his arms out to his sides, and I bent these arms down with a light shining from above, the tops of the arms would still be illuminated because they were calculated based on its original position up here. So even though they've been put down to their side, that calculation doesn't get updated. It's still illuminated along the top of that arm and shadowed along the bottom. So you cannot deform an object space mesh and still have it light correctly. Tangent space, because it's based on each individual face in relation to each other, can always be deformed, which gives it a more distinct advantage in terms of being used for characters and various other things. So tangent space, 9 times out of 10, probably the one that you're going to be going for. If I go to my common output, I have the ability to pick an overall resolution. I have the option of tell it to keep aspect ratio or not, so if I have this on, if I change one of them, the other one will automatically change. But we can have textures that are not square, some that may be like 256 by 1024, a little nice long strip or something like that, depending on what your needs are. Then we have the ability to do either in world space, object space, or UV space. Object space and world space are the most commonly used ones, so those are the ones I'm going to talk about. I'm going to ignore UV space. World space basically means that the objects are really close to each other, sitting right on top of each other. Object space basically means, quite simply, that they're located in the same general, and by them I actually mean the faces, are located in the same general distance from their centers. So if I take two objects here and I were to bake them, and I just press insert, try that again, insert, there you go, and we look at this, insert again, this guy's center is over here, while this guy's centered here. These guys will not work in object space because they don't share the same kind of center pivot. So it's relative to their center pivot. So in object space, these two would work because their centers relative to their centers, the center of their vertices. So object space right over top of each other, world space right over top of each other, object space relative to the centers. Then we have these three here, which relate to filtering, super sampling, anti-aliasing. It's all kind of the same general family. And basically what it means is that it's calculating the edge, trying to get rid of the aliasing on things. If I'm trying to do something like a bake of a diffuse color map or shaded map, and I do not want things to be become blurry, then I'm going to want to make sure that these guys are set to the lowest possible values. So I'd go ahead and set this guy down, and probably triangular a box. And this would ensure that when it bakes the texture off of one object with lighting and so on onto the next object, that it won't become slightly blurry. So that will help me there. In this particular case, I'm baking a normal map, so it may be better to have them up. It'll be up to you. Do some tests and see what works best for your specific example, because each example is going to be a little bit different. The next thing is hugely important. This is the fill texture seams. Now for this particular example, it's not actually hugely important, but for an unwrapped character or a prop or something like that, it does become very important. The fact of the matter is, when you're dealing with textures that have a resolution and UVs, and let's just go to the UV texture editor here, panels, panel, UV texture editor. Right here, every time I zoom in, let's open that up a bit more. When I zoom in and zoom in and zoom in, I'm not seeing actual pixels. I can zoom in and zoom in forever and never actually see a pixel. That's because they're resolution independent. They don't actually base on resolution, they're just based on simple math. The information from this point to this point, and it just calculates the line between them. That line between them can lead to a problem. Let's display it in Photoshop. I'm going to create a new image. I'll just go, how about something lower res, 512 by 512. I'll draw a line. I'm just going to zoom in on that line and zoom in and zoom in and zoom in and zoom in. Keep on zooming. And what you'll see is actual pixels, and yet there's this other set of lines here. That set of lines is because what I've created is just a vector object. It's a shape, and it's got like an overall path, and that's resolution independent, but it's based in a world with resolution. And you look at this, in this section right here, there's some overlap of that pixel coming from outside, which is whitish, and this is supposed to be a completely black line. So what happens is this little bit is invading that region, and of course because of anti-aliasing, along this edge over here, this guy is gray instead of black. And so because of this stepped kind of mode and this resolution independency, we end up with problems where along the seams of UVs, we get these kind of ugly borders. So what the fill texture seams does is it takes all the information along the border and it duplicates it, ensuring a better chance of any of those overlapping pixels being out of the way. Now I've noted with most bakes, the default of 1 is not enough. 2 is usually the best possible option to try and fill that in. Now in this particular case, these UVs go exactly perfectly to the edge, which means that fill texture seams can't actually do anything useful. So in this particular case, I might as well just leave it down to 1 because it's not going to make any difference. But when you do have a character that's sitting within these UV coordinates, and you have these open seams, those things you're going to need at least a minimum of 2 in order to get it to bake correctly without having any seam issues. So that's essentially the main importance to this particular tool set. There are other things that can be considered, like what UV set that you're going to bake to, if you want to display the mesh or the envelope or both at the same time. The search envelope also has coordinates that you can use to calculate. And if I just go ahead and show the envelope, you can see right here, and that search envelope can be pushed away from that surface. Let's show actually both of them. You can see how far outwards it's going to search before it kind of gives up. So this is just to aid in that process. Now in some cases you may have a surface which is a little bit awkward, and it causes essentially entanglement for the search envelope. And when you get that entanglement, that's usually when errors start to creep in, so you have to be careful of that. So that can sometimes come from the history of the object, maybe deleting the history of the object. Sometimes exporting it as an OBJ and bringing it back in can sometimes clean up some of those issues. It can also be the normals of the original object. Unlock the normals and maybe average them out before you go. So that's making a normal map inside of Maya, and what you would do with a normal map. So hopefully this was useful information, and I'm going to stop that right there.